when 6-year-old Emma Taylor tripped and scraped her knee in the lobby of Pinnacle Financial Tower. She was just another face in the bustling corporate crowd. But what happened next would change everything her mother thought she knew about success and worth. Oliver Wilson, a security guard earning minimum wage, did something so simple yet profound that it left CEO Charlotte Taylor questioning everything she'd built her empire upon. With nothing but a first aid kit and genuine compassion, the single father accomplished what months of expensive specialists couldn't achieve. He reached a frightened little girl's heart. But Charlotte had no idea she was watching one of the most qualified professionals in the country, a man whose expertise had been systematically overlooked by her own industry. What she discovered about Oliver's true identity would expose a devastating failure in her company and transform how she saw people. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The polished granite floors of Pinnacle Financial Tower's main lobby gleamed like mirrors under the harsh LED lighting, reflecting the hurried steps of executives, consultants, and business professionals who moved through this space with practiced efficiency. At exactly 4:47 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, the rhythmic symphony of clicking heels, muffled conversations, and electronic door chimes was shattered by a sound that cut through the corporate atmosphere like a blade through silk. A scream, high-pitched, terrified, and unmistakably that of a young person in genuine distress. 6-year-old Emma Taylor lay sprawled on the unforgiving stone floor near the building's central fountain, her small body trembling as she clutched her right knee. Blood seeped through her torn white tights, creating an alarming crimson stain that seemed to expand with each passing second. Her patent leather shoes, so carefully polished that morning, now pointed in different directions as she struggled to understand what had happened. The fall had been sudden and completely unexpected. Emma had been walking alongside her nanny, Mrs. Patterson, when she'd spotted something fascinating in the lobby's decorative fountain, a penny that caught the light in just the right way. In her excitement to get a closer look, she'd broken away from Mrs. Patterson's gentle grip and rushed toward the water feature. But the transition from the lobby's carpeted seating area to the granite surround had been treacherous for small feet in smooth-soled shoes. Her momentum had carried her forward even as her feet slipped backward, sending her crashing down onto the sharp corner of the fountain's marble edge. The impact had torn through her tights and scraped away several layers of skin, leaving a wound that was both painful and frightening to a 6-year-old who had never experienced anything more serious. Then a paper cut. "Mommy!" Emma cried out, her voice echoing off the lobby's soaring ceilings. But Charlotte Taylor was 37 floors above in a critical board meeting, completely unaware that her daughter was experiencing the most terrifying moment of her young life. The corporate crowd's reaction was as predictable as it was heartbreaking. Business people in expensive suits paused momentarily in their trajectories, their eyes registering the scene with the detached concern of individuals whose primary focus was elsewhere. A few pulled out their smartphones, some possibly to call for help, others perhaps to document the unusual disruption to their ordered environment. Mrs. Patterson, a kind but elderly woman who had been caring for Emma for only 3 weeks, hovered nearby with obvious distress. Her hands fluttered helplessly as she tried to assess the situation while managing her own panic. Oh dear," she repeated, her British accent more pronounced under stress. "We need to get you cleaned up, love. Don't cry now, it will be all right." But Mrs. Patterson's words seemed to increase rather than decrease Emma's distress. The nanny's own anxiety was palpable, and Emma, with the emotional radar that young people possess, could sense that the adult who was supposed to know what to do was as frightened as she was. The bleeding continued, and Emma's cries grew louder and more desperate. She didn't understand why it hurt so much, why there was so much red liquid on her leg, or why all the adults around her seemed frozen in place. The fountain that had seemed so magical moments before now loomed above her like some kind of stone monster that had attacked her for no reason. "It hurts," she sobbed, her small hands reaching toward the wound, but not quite daring to touch it. "It hurts so much." The pain was unlike anything in her carefully protected experience. Emma's world had been one of soft surfaces, protective gear, and constant supervision designed to prevent exactly this kind of incident. Her playgrounds had safety mats, her bicycle came with training wheels and a full helmet setup, and her daily activities were structured to minimize any possibility of injury. This raw, unexpected pain was not only physical, but existentially terrifying. It represented a crack in the protective bubble that her mother's wealth and attention had created around her. A sudden intrusion of the random dangers that existed in the world, despite all attempts to eliminate them. The lobby's acoustic properties, designed to impress visitors with the building's grandeur, amplified Emma's distress to every corner of the vast space. Her cries bounced off marble walls and glass surfaces, creating an almost supernatural effect that made her sound even more alone and frightened than she actually was. Mrs. Patterson fumbled in her purse for tissues, but the practical first aid supplies that might have been useful in this situation were nowhere to be found. The elderly nanny had been hired for her experience with behavioral management and educational activities, not for medical emergencies. She possessed an advanced degree in early childhood development, but had never been trained to handle injuries more serious than a bruised finger. "Someone needs to call her mother," Mrs. Patterson said to no one in particular, her own voice beginning to shake. "She's in a meeting, but this is quite serious, isn't it?" The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, but remained at a respectful distance. These were people who understood corporate hierarchies and appropriate boundaries. They recognized that this was someone else's responsibility, someone else's emergency to handle. They had their own appointments to keep, their own crises to manage, their own carefully scheduled lives that did not include provisions for helping injured youngsters. In office building lobbies, a security guard should handle this, someone thought. Or perhaps building maintenance. Surely there was a protocol for this kind of situation. A proper chain of command that would ensure the incident was managed professionally and efficiently without requiring the involvement of busy executives who had not signed up to be first responders. Emma's sobs continued to echo through the space, each cry a reminder that despite all the power and resources contained within Pinnacle Financial Tower, despite the millions of dollars in assets and the collective expertise of hundreds of professionals, no one seemed to know how to help one small, frightened, bleeding girl who just wanted her mother. The granite floor remained cold and unforgiving beneath her, and the blood continued to seep through her torn tights, creating a small but growing stain on the pristine surface that someone would eventually have to clean. But for now, Emma remained exactly where she had fallen, alone in her pain, despite being surrounded by dozens of adults who possessed every professional qualification except the one that mattered most in this moment, the simple human instinct to help. 37 floors above the lobby crisis. Charlotte Taylor commanded the most prestigious conference room in Pinnacle Financial Tower, with the kind of presence that had earned her the CEO position at Meridian Capital at the unprecedented age of 34. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline, but Charlotte's attention was focused entirely on the holographic display that showed real-time market data from around the globe. "The Tokyo markets opened strong," she said, her voice carrying the confident authority that had become her trademark in boardrooms across 3 continents. "But we're seeing unusual volatility in the European sectors that could impact our third quarter projections." The 12 board members seated around the obsidian conference table represented collectively over 200 years of financial experience and controlled assets worth more than $40 billion. Each had been personally recruited by Charlotte during her aggressive expansion of Meridian Capital from a regional investment firm to a global financial powerhouse. Dr. Robert Stevenson, the company's chief financial officer, nodded approvingly at Charlotte's analysis. "Your predictive algorithms have been remarkably accurate," he acknowledged. "The Singapore acquisition alone has exceeded our projections by 18%. Charlotte allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. The Singapore deal had been her personal triumph, a complex international merger that had required 14 months of negotiations, regulatory approval from 5 different countries, and the kind of strategic thinking that separated successful executives from merely competent ones. The financial press had called it the deal of the decade, and it had solidified Charlotte's reputation as one of the most innovative leaders in modern finance. But success at Charlotte's level came with costs that were measured in more than just monetary terms. Her rise to the top of Meridian Capital had required sacrifices that she'd convinced herself were temporary necessities, strategic choices that would eventually allow her to create the perfect life for both herself and Emma. The irony was that everything Charlotte did was ostensibly for her daughter's benefit. Every late-night negotiation, every weekend conference call, every business trip that stretched from days into weeks was part of building an empire that would ensure Emma never experienced the financial insecurity that had defined Charlotte's own youth. Charlotte had grown up in a middle-class household where her parents, both hard-working public school teachers, had struggled to make ends meet despite their dedication and intelligence. She'd watched her mother work second jobs to pay for Charlotte's college applications, had seen her father take on extra tutoring assignments to afford the SAT prep courses that would give their daughter competitive advantages they'd never had. Themselves, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The lesson Charlotte had internalized was simple. Financial security was the foundation of all other forms of security. If she could accumulate enough wealth, wield enough influence, and build enough professional success, she could protect Emma from every possible vulnerability that an uncertain world might present. This philosophy had driven her through the grueling years at Wharton Business School, where she'd graduated summa cum laude while working part-time to minimize her student loan debt. It had sustained her through the early years at Goldman Sachs, where 18-hour days were considered normal and weekends were viewed as optional obstacles to productivity. When Emma was born 3 years ago, Charlotte had taken exactly 6 weeks of maternity leave before returning to work with even greater intensity. She'd hired the best nannies, enrolled Emma in the most prestigious early learning programs, and created a trust fund that would ensure her daughter's financial security for multiple generations. But what Charlotte hadn't anticipated was how the demands of building an empire would create an ever-widening distance between her and the person she was doing it all for. Emma's daily schedule was managed by a rotation of highly qualified caregivers who provided everything except the one thing that couldn't be outsourced: her mother's consistent presence. The Hong Kong expansion is proceeding ahead of schedule, Charlotte continued, clicking through slides that showed projected growth curves and market penetration strategies. We should be able to announce the new Pacific Rim division by the end of next quarter. The board members took notes on tablets that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, their attention focused entirely on the financial implications of Charlotte's presentations. These were individuals who understood that success at this level required complete dedication, that building global financial empires meant accepting that personal relationships would necessarily take a secondary role to professional obligations. Charlotte's personal assistant, Jonathan Mitchell, sat discreetly in the corner of the room, monitoring 3 different phones for urgent communications that might require the CEO's immediate attention. He'd been specifically instructed that only true emergencies should interrupt board meetings. But the definition of emergency in Charlotte's world was quite narrow. A client losing $50 million in a currency fluctuation was an emergency. A regulatory investigation that could impact their operating licenses was an emergency. A competitor attempting a hostile takeover was definitely an emergency. A 6-year-old girl falling down in a lobby was not typically classified as an emergency, particularly when there were qualified caregivers present to handle the situation. Mrs. Patterson had been specifically hired to manage such incidents without requiring Charlotte's involvement during critical business hours. The truth was that Charlotte's entire professional identity was built on the premise that she could control outcomes through preparation, analysis, and resource allocation. She'd developed sophisticated risk management strategies that accounted for market volatility, regulatory changes, and competitive threats. She'd created contingency plans for economic downturns, leadership transitions, and technological disruptions. But parenthood presented variables that couldn't be quantified in spreadsheets or managed through strategic planning. Emma's emotional needs couldn't be optimized like a portfolio or scheduled like a board meeting. The unpredictable nature of raising a young person conflicted with Charlotte's fundamental belief that successful people could control their circumstances through superior planning and execution. The regulatory environment in Southeast Asia presents some challenges, Charlotte was saying when her assistant's phone began vibrating with increasing urgency. Jonathan glanced at the display and saw several missed calls from Mrs. Patterson, each marked as urgent. The board discussion continued around the table as Charlotte outlined her strategies for navigating international banking regulations. Her voice steady and confident as she addressed concerns about political stability and currency exchange risks. She was completely absorbed in the kind of complex problem-solving that had made her professional reputation, unaware that 37 floors below, her daughter was experiencing the kind of crisis that no amount of financial expertise could prevent or solve. Market conditions in emerging economies require adaptive strategies, Charlotte explained, her laser pointer highlighting specific data points on the holographic display. We need to remain flexible while maintaining our core growth objectives. The meeting was scheduled to continue for another 90 minutes, followed by a private dinner with potential investors from Dubai, who were considering a partnership that could open new markets across the Middle East. Charlotte's evening schedule included reviewing briefing materials for tomorrow's conference call with London and preparing for next week's presentation to the Federal Reserve Board. Emma's bedtime story, if it happened at all, would be read by Mrs. Patterson from a carefully selected book that combined educational content with age-appropriate entertainment. Charlotte had personally approved a library of literature designed to promote cognitive development and cultural literacy, ensuring that even Emma's leisure reading served the larger goal of preparing her for future academic success. The distance between Charlotte's conference room and the lobby where her daughter lay bleeding was measured in more than just floors and elevator rides. It was the distance between a world where problems were solved through expertise and resources, and a world where healing sometimes required nothing more than human compassion and the willingness to sit on a cold floor with someone who was scared and hurt. Oliver Wilson had been making his routine security rounds through Pinnacle Financial Tower's lower levels when Emma's cries echoed through the marble corridors, reaching him in the building's mechanical room where he'd been checking the HVAC monitoring systems. The sound was unmistakable, not the frustrated whimper of a tired youngster or the attention-seeking wail of someone testing boundaries, but the genuine distress call of a person in real pain and fear. 23 years of experience had taught Oliver to distinguish between different types of crisis situations based on subtle audio cues that most people never consciously registered. The pitch, duration, and quality of Emma's cries told him immediately that this was a medical situation requiring prompt attention, not a behavioral issue that could be managed through distraction or negotiation. He emerged from the mechanical room at a controlled, but urgent pace, his heavy-duty radio crackling with chatter from other security personnel who had also heard the disturbance. "Control, this is Wilson," he said into the device as he approached the lobby. "I'm responding to what sounds like a medical situation near the main fountain, requesting ambulance standby." The scene that greeted Oliver in the lobby was unfortunately familiar from his years in emergency response. A genuine crisis surrounded by well-meaning but ineffective helpers who lacked the training or confidence to take decisive action. Emma remained on the cold granite floor, her cries now interspersed with hiccuping sobs that indicated she was beginning to hyperventilate from panic and pain. Mrs. Patterson knelt nearby, her hands fluttering helplessly as she tried to comfort Emma without really knowing how to address the injury itself. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger but remained at a respectful distance, their corporate instincts telling them to wait for someone with official authority to take charge of the situation. Oliver assessed the scene with the methodical efficiency that had once made him one of the most respected emergency medical technicians in the state system. His eyes quickly cataloged the relevant details, the location and apparent severity of Emma's injury, her current level of distress, the environmental factors that might complicate treatment, and the resources immediately available. "Excuse me, folks," Oliver said in a calm but authoritative voice that somehow managed to cut through the ambient noise of the lobby without being aggressive or alarming. "I need you to give us some space here. The crowd responded immediately to his tone, recognizing the voice of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. They stepped back in an orderly fashion, creating a clear perimeter around Emma while remaining close enough to observe what would happen next. Oliver knelt beside Emma with a smooth, practiced motion that kept his uniform clean while bringing him to her eye level. His approach was deliberate and unhurried, designed to project competence and calm rather than the frantic energy that often accompany the emergency situations. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice warm and reassuring. "My name is Oliver, and I'm here to help you. Can you tell me your name?" Emma looked up at him through tears, her small face streaked with mascara from her nanny's attempt to comfort her. Something in Oliver's demeanor, perhaps the way he spoke to her directly rather than talking over her to the adults, or maybe the obvious confidence with which he'd taken control of the situation, seemed to calm her slightly. "Emma," she whispered, her voice still shaky but no longer approaching the hysteria that had characterized her earlier cries. "That's a beautiful name, Emma," Oliver replied, reaching into the medical kit he always carried on his belt. "I have a daughter about your age, and she had an accident just like this one a few months ago. Would you like me to take a look at your knee and see if we can make it feel better?" The medical kit Oliver carried was far more comprehensive than the basic first aid supplies typically issued to security personnel. It contained sterile gauze pads, antiseptic wipes, medical tape, instant cold packs, and a small bottle of pediatric pain reliever supplies he'd assembled based on his professional experience rather than company policy. "It hurts really bad," Emma said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "There's blood everywhere." "I know it hurts," Oliver acknowledged, gently examining the wound without touching it directly. "And you're being very brave. The bleeding looks scary, but it's not as bad as it seems. Sometimes our bodies are really good at making small injuries look bigger than they actually are." His assessment was accurate. The wound was definitely painful and would require proper cleaning and bandaging, but it wasn't deep enough to require stitches or emergency room treatment. The blood, while alarming to a 6-year-old, was already beginning to clot naturally. Oliver opened his medical kit with practiced efficiency, his movements smooth and confident as he prepared the supplies he would need. "Emma, I'm going to clean this up for you, but first I need to know if you're allergic to any medicines or if you have any special medical conditions I should know about." Mrs. Patterson, who had been watching Oliver's intervention with obvious relief, spoke up quickly. "No allergies that I know of," she said. "She's a very healthy little girl. Should I call her mother? She's in a meeting upstairs, but let's get Emma comfortable first," Oliver suggested gently. "Then we can decide if we need to interrupt her mother's work." It was a diplomatic response that acknowledged Mrs. Patterson's concern, while keeping the focus on Emma's immediate needs. Oliver had observed enough family dynamics during his years in emergency services to understand that different households had different approaches to managing crises, and he'd learned to avoid making assumptions about what parents would or wouldn't want to know. He turned his attention back to Emma, whose breathing had begun to normalize as she watched him prepare the medical supplies. "Okay, sweetheart, I'm going to use this special wipe to clean around your knee. It might sting a little bit, but only for a few seconds. Can you count to 10 with me while I do it?" The counting technique was one Oliver had developed during his years as a pediatric emergency specialist. Young patients responded well to having a specific task to focus on during uncomfortable procedures, and the counting provided a clear endpoint that made the experience feel manageable rather than endless. 1, 2, 3. Emma began, her voice still shaky but growing stronger as she focused on the numbers. Oliver worked with gentle efficiency, cleaning the wound and the surrounding area while maintaining a steady stream of encouraging commentary. "You're doing great, Emma. 4, 5, 6. I can see this is healing already. 7, 8, 9. 10, Emma said with obvious pride, looking down at her knee to see that the frightening blood had been cleaned away and the actual injury was much smaller than it had appeared. "Perfect counting," Oliver praised, opening a sterile gauze pad. "Now I'm going to put this special bandage on your knee. It's going to protect the scrape while it heals, kind of like armor for your leg." The bandage he applied was professional grade, secured with medical tape that would stay in place through normal activity, but could be removed easily when the time came to check the healing progress. He added a small instant cold pack, showing Emma how to hold it against the bandage to reduce swelling and pain. "There we go," Oliver said, sitting back on his heels to admire his handiwork. "How does that feel?" Emma experimentally moved her leg, testing the range of motion and discovering that the sharp pain had been replaced by a much more manageable ache. "Better," she said with obvious surprise. "It doesn't hurt anymore." "It might hurt a little bit when you walk," Oliver warned, "but nothing like it did before. And in a few days, you'll probably forget it ever happened." Mrs. Patterson watched this entire interaction with growing amazement. In less than 10 minutes, Oliver had transformed a crisis that had left her feeling completely helpless into a manageable situation where Emma was actually smiling. His combination of medical competence and gentle bedside manner had accomplished what she'd been unable to achieve despite her advanced degrees in childhood development. "Thank you so much," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice full of genuine gratitude. "I've never seen anything like that. You're obviously very experienced with this sort of thing." Oliver simply smiled as he packed up his medical kit, deflecting the praise with the modest professionalism that had characterized his entire career. "Just part of the job," he said, making sure everyone in the building stays safe and comfortable. But as he helped Emma to her feet and watched her take tentative steps to test her newly bandaged knee, Oliver felt the familiar satisfaction that had once defined his professional identity. For a few minutes, he'd been able to use his real skills to help someone who genuinely needed his expertise, and the experience reminded him of everything he'd lost when his career was destroyed by circumstances beyond his control. Emma Taylor's life had been carefully constructed to represent the pinnacle of privileged childhood in modern America. Every element designed and optimized by her mother's relentless pursuit of providing advantages that money could buy. Her daily routine began at 6:15 a.m. in her custom-designed bedroom in their penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, where specialized blackout curtains ensured exactly 8.5 hours of sleep, based on the latest pediatric research. An optimal rest for developing minds. Breakfast was prepared by Elena Martinez, their full-time housekeeper and chef, who held a degree in nutritional science and had been specifically hired to create meals that supported cognitive development and physical growth. Emma's morning nutrition always included organic blueberries for antioxidants, wild-caught salmon for omega-3 fatty acids, and vegetables selected for their vitamin content rather than their appeal to a 6-year-old palate. The commute to Whitmore Academy, Manhattan's most exclusive private school, took place in a specially modified SUV equipped with educational programming designed to maximize learning during transport time. Emma spent these 20-minute rides listening to language immersion podcasts in French and Mandarin, or reviewing mathematics concepts through interactive games on a tablet, programmed with advanced learning algorithms. Whitmore Academy itself represented everything Charlotte believed education should provide. Small class sizes with student-to-teacher ratios that allowed for individualized attention, a curriculum that integrated advanced STEM concepts with classical liberal arts education, and extracurricular programs designed to develop leadership skills and cultural sophistication. Emma's classmates were the children of ambassadors, technology executives, entertainment industry leaders, and international business moguls. Their conversations at lunch involved discussions of family trips to private islands and weekends at country estates that most adults would never see. The school's culture emphasized achievement, competition, and the development of skills that would prepare students for admission to Ivy League universities and eventual leadership positions in global industries. But for Emma, this carefully orchestrated environment felt more like an elegant prison than a nurturing educational experience. The constant emphasis on optimization and achievement left little room for the simple pleasures that most young people took for granted. Unstructured play, friendship based on genuine affection rather than social positioning, and the freedom to explore interests without them being evaluated for their contribution to long-term academic or professional goals. After school, Emma's schedule continued with private tutoring sessions designed to accelerate her progress beyond grade-level expectations. Mondays were devoted to advanced mathematics with Dr. Patricia Hoffman, a former MIT professor who specialized in developing mathematical intuition in gifted young students. Tuesdays meant violin lessons with Maestro Giuseppe Fontana, whose previous students had won international competitions and performed at Carnegie Hall. Wednesdays brought French conversation practice with Madame Colette Dubois, a former diplomat, who insisted on maintaining formal pronunciation standards that would prepare Emma for eventual study abroad programs. Thursdays were reserved for chess instruction with Master Vladimir Petrov, who trained multiple junior champions and believed that strategic thinking developed through chess would provide advantages in any future competitive environment. Fridays offered the closest thing to recreational activity in Emma's schedule. Supervised visits to culturally significant locations around Manhattan, guided by Dr. Margaret Sterling, an art history professor who provided detailed educational context for every museum, gallery, and historical site they visited. The irony was that each of these experiences was objectively valuable and would have been treasured by many young people who lacked access to such resources. Emma was receiving an education that cost more per year than most families' entire household income, learning from experts who normally worked with graduate students or professional adults. Yet the relentless focus on optimization had drained much of the joy from learning itself. Emma approached each lesson, each activity, each educational opportunity with the weary resignation of someone who understood that her performance was being constantly evaluated against external standards rather than internal curiosity or genuine interest. The emotional cost of this lifestyle had begun manifesting in ways that concerned even her highly qualified caregivers. Emma had developed what Dr. Sandra Chun, her pediatric psychologist, classified as gifted kid syndrome, a collection of behaviors that included perfectionist anxiety, social isolation and a persistent fear of disappointing the adults who had invested so much in her development. Sleep had become increasingly difficult, with Emma often lying awake reviewing the day's lessons and worrying about tomorrow's expectations. Her appetite had decreased as mealtimes became another opportunity for optimization rather than pleasure. Most troubling, she'd begun to withdraw from social interactions, even with other young people who shared similar backgrounds and educational experiences. Charlotte had responded to these concerns with characteristic efficiency, hiring additional specialists to address each symptom. Dr. Chen provided weekly therapy sessions focused on anxiety management and self-esteem building. A pediatric sleep specialist had been consulted to optimize Emma's bedtime routine and bedroom environment. A nutritionist worked with Elena to create more appealing presentations for the scientifically formulated meals. But what none of these highly qualified professionals could provide was the one thing Emma needed most: unstructured time with a parent who was present not to evaluate or optimize, but simply to enjoy her company. Charlotte's love for her daughter was genuine and profound, but it was expressed primarily through the acquisition of resources and opportunities rather than through emotional availability and shared experiences. The result was a 6-year-old who possessed extraordinary knowledge and skills, but lacked confidence in her own worth beyond her achievements. Emma could discuss art history with adult sophistication and solve mathematical problems that challenged much older students, but she couldn't fall asleep without worrying about whether her performance that day had met expectations. Mrs. Patterson, Emma's current nanny, was the 4th caregiver Charlotte had hired in the past year. Each of her predecessors had been exceptionally qualified former teachers with advanced degrees, child development specialists with impressive credentials, European au pairs with multiple language fluencies. But each had eventually reached the conclusion that Emma's needs extended beyond what could be provided through professional expertise alone. Emma rarely cried or complained openly about her situation, having learned early that emotional expressions were viewed as problems to be solved rather than communications to be understood. When she scraped her knee in the lobby of Pinnacle Financial Tower, the intensity of her distress reflected not just physical pain, but the accumulated weight of months of suppressed anxiety and loneliness. The blood on her tights represented the first genuine crisis in her carefully controlled world, a moment when all the optimization and preparation couldn't prevent something scary and painful from happening. For the first time in her young life, Emma was experiencing something that couldn't be improved through additional resources or expert intervention. Mrs. Patterson's obvious panic in response to the situation only amplified Emma's fear, confirming her growing suspicion that the adults responsible for her care were not as competent and reliable as they appeared. If her nanny didn't know how to handle a scraped knee, what would happen when she faced more serious challenges in life? The corporate environment of Pinnacle Financial Tower, with its emphasis on efficiency and professional achievement, seemed to Emma like an extension of her daily world, a place where everyone was too busy being important to pay attention to the needs of someone small and scared. The fact that dozens of well-dressed adults walked past her without offering help reinforced her sense that her value as a person was contingent on her ability to avoid causing inconvenience to others. When Oliver Wilson knelt beside her and spoke to her directly, treating her as a person worthy of attention and care rather than a problem to be managed, Emma experienced something that had been largely absent from her highly structured life: genuine human connection offered freely without conditions or expectations for reciprocal performance. Dr. Oliver James Wilson had once commanded the emergency medical services of Metropolitan General Hospital's pediatric trauma unit, where his innovative approaches to treating injured young people had earned him recognition as one of the most skilled emergency medical professionals on the East Coast. His office on the hospital's 10th floor had been filled with commendations from grateful families, professional awards from medical associations, and photographs documenting his participation in international medical missions that brought advanced trauma care to underserved communities around the world. For 12 years, Oliver had represented the absolute pinnacle of emergency medical expertise, developing protocols that had been adopted by hospitals across the country and training methods that had improved survival rates for critically injured young patients by more than 30%. His textbook, Pediatric Emergency Response: Advanced Techniques for Critical Care, had become required reading in medical schools and EMT training programs nationwide. The transformation from Dr. Wilson to Oliver, the security guard, hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual erosion of everything he'd built, like watching a sandcastle dissolve beneath the advancing tide of circumstances that no amount of professional competence could prevent or control. The crisis had begun with what should have been a routine emergency call on a rainy Thursday evening in October. 7-year-old Marcus Rodriguez had fallen from a playground structure at his elementary school during after-hours programming, sustaining what appeared to be a straightforward leg fracture that should have been easily treatable with standard emergency protocols. Oliver had responded to the call with his usual efficiency, leading a team of EMTs and emergency medical technicians and providing immediate stabilization and transport to Metropolitan General's Pediatric Trauma Center. The initial assessment had been correct. Marcus had suffered a clean break of his left tibia that would require surgical repair, but posed no immediate threat to his life or long-term mobility. The surgery itself had proceeded without complications. Dr. Sarah Martinez, one of the hospital's most experienced pediatric orthopedic surgeons, had successfully realigned the fractured bone and secured it with titanium hardware that would allow normal healing and eventual return to full activity. Marcus had responded well to anesthesia. His vital signs had remained stable throughout the procedure, and his post-operative recovery had followed expected patterns. But 18 hours after the surgery, Marcus had developed what medical professionals termed a rare but known complication, a blood clot that formed near the surgical site and traveled to his lungs, creating a pulmonary embolism that proved fatal despite immediate intervention by the hospital's most skilled specialists. The Medical Review Board's investigation had been thorough and ultimately concluded that Marcus's death was an unforeseeable tragedy that could not have been prevented through any different course of action. Every protocol had been followed correctly, every decision had been medically appropriate, and every member of the treatment team had performed their duties with exemplary skill and professionalism. But Marcus's parents, devastated by the loss of their son and searching for someone to hold accountable for their unimaginable grief, had filed a malpractice lawsuit that named every medical professional who had been involved in their son's care. Oliver, as the emergency response team leader who had made the initial assessment and transport decisions, was identified as the primary defendant. The legal proceedings that followed had consumed 3 years of Oliver's life and destroyed everything he'd worked to build. Even though the medical evidence clearly supported the conclusion that Marcus's death was a tragic but unavoidable outcome, the legal system required detailed examination of every decision, every protocol, and every moment of Marcus's treatment. Oliver's malpractice insurance had covered the financial costs of his legal defense, but no policy could protect him from the emotional toll of having his professional competence questioned by attorneys who possessed no medical training but unlimited time to scrutinize split-second decisions made under life and death pressure. The depositions had been particularly devastating. Hour after hour, Oliver had been forced to justify decisions that had been based on 20 years of medical experience and training, explaining to lawyers who had never saved a life why he had chosen one treatment approach over another, why he had prioritized certain assessments, why he had followed established protocols that had proven successful in thousands of previous cases. The case had been extensively covered by local media, with news reports that focused on the emotional story of a family's loss rather than the complex medical realities that had contributed to the tragedy. Oliver's reputation, built over decades of exemplary service, was reduced to headlines that associated his name with a young person's death, regardless of the actual circumstances involved, even after the lawsuit was ultimately dismissed by a judge who concluded that the medical evidence did not support claims of negligence or malpractice. The damage to Oliver's career was irreversible. Hospital administrators, worried about insurance liability and public relations complications, had quietly suggested that he might be happier pursuing opportunities elsewhere. Medical colleagues, who had once respected his expertise, began treating him with the uncomfortable distance that professionals maintain around someone who has been touched by litigation, regardless of its outcome. The medical community's response to malpractice accusations was institutional, self-protection rather than support for professionals who had been unfairly targeted. Oliver's hospital privileges were not technically revoked, but the opportunities for him to use those privileges became increasingly rare. Department meetings that had once included his input on protocol development were scheduled without his participation. Training programs that had featured his expertise were restructured around other instructors. The most devastating blow had been personal rather than professional. Oliver's wife, Dr. Jennifer Wilson, was herself a respected physician who had built her own career in internal medicine. The stress of the lawsuit, the financial uncertainty, and the social isolation that accompanied being associated with a malpractice case had gradually eroded their marriage, until she decided that her own professional reputation required distance from Oliver's legal complications. Their divorce had been finalized just 6 months after the lawsuit was dismissed, leaving Oliver not only professionally isolated but personally alone as well. Jennifer had remarried within a year, wedding a cardiologist whose reputation was unblemished by any legal complications, and had moved across the country to establish a new practice in California. Oliver had spent his life savings on legal fees that his insurance hadn't covered, lost his marriage to stress and social pressure, and found himself professionally unmarketable, despite possessing some of the most advanced emergency medical skills in the country. At 41 years old, he was starting over with no clear path forward and no professional network willing to provide references or recommendations. The security guard position at Pinnacle Financial Tower had been one of the few jobs available to someone with his complicated history. The private security company that managed building safety had been willing to hire him based on his emergency response background, viewing his medical training as an asset for a facility that hosted thousands of employees and visitors daily. For the past 18 months, Oliver had been learning to find satisfaction in work that utilized almost none of his actual capabilities. His medical expertise was legally and practically irrelevant to his job responsibilities, which focused on monitoring surveillance systems, checking identification badges, and maintaining the kind of visible security presence that made corporate executives feel confident about their facility's safety. The irony was devastating. Oliver possessed advanced training in exactly the kind of emergency medical situations that occurred regularly in large office buildings: heart attacks, choking incidents, allergic reactions, and traumatic injuries like Emma's scraped knee. But his ability to help was limited by both company policy and his own legal vulnerability. His supervisor had made it clear during orientation that security personnel were expected to call for professional medical assistance rather than provide treatment themselves, regardless of their personal qualifications. The company's insurance policy specifically prohibited employees from performing medical procedures beyond basic first aid, and Oliver's history with malpractice litigation made him particularly sensitive to the legal risks of exceeding those boundaries. Yet when he'd heard Emma's cries echoing through the lobby, every instinct developed over 20 years of emergency medicine had compelled him to respond. The training that had saved countless lives couldn't be turned off simply because his professional circumstances had changed. His hands knew how to assess injuries, his voice knew how to calm frightened patients, and his mind knew how to make the rapid decisions that transformed medical crises into manageable situations. Oliver had managed to maintain his EMIT certification through continuing education courses that he paid for himself, attending weekend seminars and online training, programs that kept his skills current even though he had no official opportunity to use them. He'd told himself that someday he might find a way back into emergency medicine, perhaps through volunteer work or international humanitarian missions that wouldn't require the kind of institutional credentialing that had become impossible for him to obtain. His apartment in Queens was modest but comfortable, furnished with medical textbooks and equipment that served as reminders of his former life. He'd kept his stethoscope, his blood pressure monitor, and the emergency medical kit that he'd assembled over years of professional experience. These items had no practical purpose in his current circumstances, but he couldn't bring himself to dispose of them. When Emma had looked up at him with tears in her eyes and genuine trust in her expression, Oliver had experienced something he hadn't felt since Marcus Rodriguez's death: the profound satisfaction of using his skills to heal someone who genuinely needed his help. For those few minutes in the lobby, he hadn't been a security guard with a complicated past. He'd been Dr. Oliver Wilson again, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The medical kit he'd used to treat Emma's injury contained supplies that he'd purchased with his own money, organized according to emergency medical protocols that he'd learned at the peak of his career. Every item had been selected based on professional experience rather than company requirements, representing his personal commitment to being prepared for situations, exactly like Emma's accident. As he'd knelt beside Emma and watched her fear transform into relief, Oliver had been reminded of everything he'd lost when his career was destroyed by circumstances beyond his control. But he'd also been reminded of something more important. His identity as a healer wasn't dependent on titles, facilities, or institutional recognition. It was something deeper, something that no lawsuit or career setback could ultimately take away from him. The question was whether anyone else would ever recognize that truth, or whether he would spend the rest of his professional life as just another security guard whose real capabilities remained invisible to everyone around him. Charlotte Taylor's board meeting had concluded 20 minutes ahead of schedule when Jonathan Mitchell approached her with the kind of measured urgency that indicated something significant but not catastrophic had occurred during her absence from regular communications. The Dubai investors had been impressed with Meridian Capital's expansion strategies, and the preliminary agreement suggested a partnership that could open entirely new markets across the Middle East. "Mrs. Taylor," Jonathan said quietly as the last board member filed out of the conference room. Mrs. Patterson called several times during the meeting. "Emma had a minor accident in the lobby, but she's been treated and is fine. I thought you should know." The word accident sent an immediate spike of adrenaline through Charlotte's system, activating the hypervigilant parental anxiety that she normally kept carefully compartmentalized during business hours. Her mind immediately began cycling through worst-case scenarios: serious injuries, hospital visits, legal complications that could disrupt both Emma's well-being and her own professional obligations. "What kind of accident?" Charlotte asked, already moving toward the elevator bank with the purposeful stride that had carried her through countless corporate crises. "How serious? Where is she now?" "Apparently she fell and scraped her knee near the fountain," Jonathan replied, keeping pace with his employer's urgent movement. Mrs. Patterson said it was handled very professionally by building security. "Emma is comfortable and waiting for you in the main lobby." Charlotte's relief at learning the injury was minor was immediately replaced by a different kind of concern. Emma's schedule included a violin lesson with Maestro Fontana in 45 minutes, followed by French conversation practice with Madame Dubois. A scraped knee shouldn't interfere with either activity, but Emma's emotional response to the incident could potentially disrupt her educational programming for the remainder of the day. The elevator seemed to descend with agonizing slowness. each floor marking Charlotte's transition from the world of international finance to the immediate realities of parenthood. By the time the doors opened onto the lobby level, she had mentally reorganized her evening schedule to accommodate potential changes to Emma's routine while minimizing disruption to tomorrow's congressional hearing preparation. What Charlotte discovered in the lobby, however, was unlike anything she had anticipated. Based on Jonathan's brief summary of the situation, Emma was seated on one of the leather chairs near the fountain, but instead of the tears and clingy behavior that typically followed any kind of physical distress, she was engaged in what appeared to be an animated conversation with Oliver Wilson. The security guard was kneeling beside her chair at eye level, holding what looked like a small notebook and listening with the kind of focused attention that Charlotte rarely saw adults give to young people's concerns. "So the pain is completely gone now?" Oliver was asking, his voice carrying a professional authority that seemed incongruous with his security uniform. "No tingling or numbness in your toes?" "Good. That means the swelling is under control." Emma nodded enthusiastically, clearly enjoying being treated as an expert on her own physical condition. "It doesn't hurt at all when I walk," she reported, "and the bandage feels really secure. Will I be able to take a bath tonight?" "Absolutely," Oliver replied, making a note in his small notebook. "Just keep the bandage dry for the first 24 hours. After that, you can remove it carefully and let the scrape air dry. Your body's natural healing process will take care of the rest." Charlotte found herself pausing at a distance to observe this interaction, struck by something she couldn't immediately identify. There was a quality to Oliver's engagement with Emma that felt different from the interactions she typically witnessed between her daughter and the various specialists, tutors, and caregivers who populated Emma's daily routine. "Mom," Emma called out, having spotted Charlotte approaching. But instead of the urgent need for comfort that usually characterized her response to minor injuries, Emma's greeting carried excitement and genuine enthusiasm. "Oliver showed me how the bandage works and explained why scraped knees heal so fast. Did you know that your skin can completely replace itself in just a few weeks?" Oliver stood respectfully as Charlotte approached, his posture professional but relaxed. "Mrs. Taylor," he said with a slight nod, "Emma handled everything very well. The injury was superficial and shouldn't cause any ongoing problems." There was something in his tone, a calm competence and clinical precision, that caught Charlotte's attention. This wasn't the kind of language she expected from building security personnel, most of whom would typically describe such situations in terms of incident reports and liability concerns rather than medical assessments and healing processes. "I understand you provided first aid," Charlotte said, extending her hand in a gesture that acknowledged both gratitude and professional respect. "Thank you for taking care of her." Oliver accepted the handshake with the kind of firm grip that suggested confidence without aggression. "Just doing my job," he replied, "making sure everyone in the building feels safe and comfortable." But as Charlotte looked more closely at the scene, she began noticing details that didn't align with her expectations of routine security response. The medical supplies visible in Oliver's kit were more comprehensive than basic first aid materials. His small notebook contained what appeared to be detailed observations written in precise handwriting. Most significantly, Emma's response to his presence suggested a level of trust and engagement that typically took weeks or months to develop with new caregivers. "Emma," Charlotte said, kneeling beside her daughter's chair, "how are you feeling? Are you ready for your violin lesson?" "Actually," Emma said with uncharacteristic assertiveness, "Oliver said I should probably skip violin today because the sitting position might put pressure on my knee in a way that could slow healing. He suggested gentle movement instead of staying in one position for too long." Charlotte looked at Oliver with raised eyebrows. This level of specific medical advice went well beyond what she would expect from security personnel, regardless of their first aid training. It demonstrated knowledge of how minor injuries could be affected by specific activities and positions, knowledge that suggested more extensive medical background than his current position would require. Is that a professional recommendation? Charlotte asked, her tone neutral but clearly seeking clarification about Oliver's qualifications to make such suggestions. Oliver seemed to recognize that he had crossed into territory that might require explanation. It's just common sense based on experience, he said carefully. Young people heal fastest when they can move naturally, rather than being forced into positions that create tension around injury sites. The answer was diplomatically phrased but didn't really address Charlotte's underlying question about his expertise. However, before she could pursue the topic further, Mrs. Patterson approached with obvious relief at seeing Charlotte arrive. "Oh, Mrs. Taylor, thank goodness you're here," the elderly nanny said, her British accent more pronounced due to residual stress from the afternoon's events. "I'm afraid I wasn't much help when Emma fell. This gentleman was absolutely wonderful, so calm and professional. I've never seen anything quite like it." Charlotte found herself studying Oliver more carefully, trying to reconcile the obvious competence he demonstrated with the modest role he occupied in the building's hierarchy. There was something about his demeanor, a quiet confidence and natural authority that suggested capabilities beyond his current job description. "Oliver explained everything to me," Emma continued, clearly still energized by the attention she'd received. "He said that being scared when you get hurt is completely normal, and that crying actually helps your body release chemicals that make healing happen faster. And he showed me how to check if an injury is serious or just looks worse than it really is." Charlotte felt a strange mixture of gratitude and unease. While she was obviously thankful that Emma had received competent care during her absence, she was also puzzled by the level of sophisticated medical explanation that Oliver had apparently provided. Most adults, even those with basic first aid training, wouldn't think to discuss the physiological aspects of stress response and healing with a 6-year-old. "That's quite extensive knowledge for a security guard," Charlotte observed, her tone suggesting curiosity rather than suspicion. Oliver's expression remained pleasant, but became slightly more guarded. "You pick up information over the years," he said, "especially when you're responsible for people's safety on a daily basis." It was another diplomatic non-answer that acknowledged her question without providing substantial information about his background. Charlotte, whose professional success was built on her ability to assess people's capabilities and motivations, found herself increasingly intrigued by the discrepancy between Oliver's current role and his apparent expertise. "Emma," she said, "why don't you gather your things while I thank Oliver properly for his help?" Emma nodded and moved toward where Mrs. Patterson was organizing her backpack and violin case, leaving Charlotte and Oliver with a moment of relative privacy. "I have to ask," Charlotte said quietly, "because what I observed goes well beyond typical security response. Do you have medical training?" Oliver was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "Some," he said finally, "emergency response background. But that's not relevant to my current position." The phrase, "not relevant to my current position," struck Charlotte as particularly interesting. It suggested that Oliver possessed qualifications that weren't being utilized in his present role, which raised questions about how someone with medical expertise had ended up working building security. "Emergency response," Charlotte repeated thoughtfully. "M2 training? Paramedic certification?" "Something like that," Oliver replied, maintaining his diplomatic distance from specifics while not actually lying about his background. Charlotte found herself genuinely curious about Oliver's story, but she also recognized that this wasn't the appropriate time or place for detailed personal inquiries. Emma was waiting. Mrs. Patterson was clearly exhausted from the afternoon stress, and Charlotte's own schedule required attention to evening responsibilities. "Well, whatever your background," she said, "I'm grateful you were here when Emma needed help. And I'm impressed with how you handled the situation. Thank you." Oliver nodded acceptingly, but Charlotte noticed that he seemed relieved to conclude the conversation before it could delve deeper into his qualifications and history. As she gathered Emma and Mrs. Patterson to leave the building, Charlotte found herself glancing back at Oliver, who had returned to his security station with the same professional demeanor he'd maintained throughout their interaction, but something about the encounter nagged at her as they rode the elevator to the parking garage. Oliver's combination of medical competence, educational ability, and natural authority with Emma suggested capabilities that were significantly underutilized in his current position. Charlotte had built her career on recognizing talent and potential, and every instinct told her that there was much more to Oliver Wilson's story than he was willing to reveal. That evening, as she helped Emma change the bandage on her knee using the supplies and techniques that Oliver had recommended, Charlotte found herself thinking about talent recognition and institutional blind spots. How many people in her own organization possessed capabilities that weren't being fully utilized? How many Oliver Wilsons were working in positions that didn't reflect their actual potential? The question bothered her enough that she made a mental note to explore the topic further when her schedule allowed. There was clearly more to learn about the security guard who had so competently cared for her daughter, and Charlotte Taylor had built her success on her ability to uncover the information that others missed. Charlotte Taylor's curiosity about Oliver Wilson had transformed from casual interest to active investigation by Thursday morning. Driven by a combination of parental gratitude and professional instinct that told her there was significantly more to discover about the man who had so competently treated Emma's injury, her executive assistant, Jonathan Mitchell, possessed research skills that had been honed through years of supporting high-level corporate decision-making, and Charlotte had learned to trust his ability to uncover information that wasn't immediately available through conventional sources. "I need you to run a comprehensive background check on Oliver Wilson," Charlotte told Jonathan during their daily briefing meeting. "He's one of the security guards here in the building. I want to know about his employment history, educational background, professional certifications, everything that's publicly available." Jonathan made notes in his tablet with the efficient precision that had made him indispensable to Charlotte's operations. "Any particular reason for the inquiry?" he asked. "Security clearance issue? Policy concern?" "Professional curiosity," Charlotte replied, which was both true and diplomatically vague. "He demonstrated some impressive capabilities yesterday, and I'm interested in understanding his background." What Jonathan discovered over the next 6 hours was far more remarkable than Charlotte had anticipated, even given her instincts about Oliver's hidden expertise. The background check revealed a professional history that read like a medical resume, rather than the employment record of a building security guard. Dr. Oliver James Wilson, licensed physician specializing in emergency medicine and pediatric trauma. Medical degree from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, graduated magna cum laude. Residency in emergency medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital, chief resident during his final year. Fellowship in pediatric emergency medicine at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where he developed innovative protocols for treating traumatic injuries in young patients. The credentials were impressive enough, but Oliver's professional achievements were even more remarkable. He had published over 30 articles in peer-reviewed medical journals, focusing on emergency response techniques and trauma management. His textbook on pediatric emergency medicine was considered the definitive resource in the field and was used in medical schools across the country, most significantly for Charlotte's growing understanding of the situation. Oliver had served as the director of pediatric emergency services at Metropolitan General Hospital for 8 years, a position that had made him one of the most respected emergency medicine specialists in the entire metropolitan area. The employment timeline showed that Oliver had left Metropolitan General approximately 18 months ago, which corresponded exactly with when he had started working as a security guard at Pinnacle Financial Tower. But the background check provided No clear explanation for why someone with his medical expertise and professional standing would make such a dramatic career change. Jonathan's research had also uncovered something that made Charlotte's blood run cold with recognition of a missed opportunity that bordered on institutional negligence. 2 years earlier, Dr. Oliver Wilson had submitted a comprehensive application for the position of Chief Medical Officer for Meridian Capital's newly created Employee Health and Wellness Division. The application had been part of Charlotte's initiative to provide comprehensive medical support for Meridian Capital's employees and their families, a program designed to reduce healthcare costs while providing premium medical services as an employee benefit. The CMO position would have been responsible for developing wellness programs, managing occupational health services, and providing emergency medical response for the company's various facilities. Charlotte remembered the initiative clearly. She had personally approved the budget for the Wellness Division, believing that providing superior healthcare benefits would help Meridian Capital attract and retain the kind of top-tier talent that drove their competitive advantage. The program was designed to be a model for corporate healthcare services, combining cost efficiency with premium medical care. Dr. Wilson's application for the CMO position had been extraordinary. His qualifications exceeded the job requirements in every category. His salary expectations had been modest for someone of his caliber, and his proposed programs had demonstrated innovative thinking that could have positioned Meridian Capital as a leader in corporate wellness services. The application had never reached human review. Meridian Capital's applicant tracking system, a sophisticated software platform that Charlotte had personally approved for its ability to efficiently screen large volumes of applications, had automatically rejected Dr. Wilson's submission due to what the system classified as incomplete documentation. The ATS had been programmed to require specific formatting for medical credentials, including verification codes from licensing boards that had to be entered in precise alphanumeric sequences. Dr. Wilson's application had included all the necessary verification information, but he had used the older formatting standard that had been valid when he'd originally received his certifications. The software had interpreted the older format as incomplete information and had automatically moved his application to the rejection pile without any human review. Within 24 hours, an automated email had been sent informing Dr. Wilson that his qualifications did not meet Meridian Capital's current requirements. The position had ultimately been filled by Dr. Amanda Foster, a competent physician with appropriate credentials but significantly less experience than Dr. Wilson. Dr. Foster had been hired not because of superior qualifications, but because her brother-in-law served on Meridian Capital's board of directors and had recommended her during a casual conversation at a charity fundraising event. Dr. Foster had been adequate in the role for the 18 months she'd held the position, but had recently relocated to Seattle with her husband and had not been replaced. The Employee Health and Wellness Division had been operating without a chief medical officer for 4 months, limiting their ability to provide the comprehensive services that Charlotte had originally envisioned. The mathematics of the institutional failure were devastating. Meridian Capital had rejected the most qualified candidate they had ever received for a critical position due to software formatting requirements, then hired a less experienced candidate through personal connections, only to lose that person to relocation and leave the position vacant. Meanwhile, the man they had rejected was working as a security guard in their own building, providing exactly the kind of expert medical services they desperately needed, for a fraction of the salary the CMO position would have commanded. Charlotte stared at the documents spread across her desk, each page revealing another layer of systematic incompetence that had occurred under her leadership. The ATS software she had personally approved had been marketed as a revolutionary tool for identifying top talent, but it had systematically excluded the most qualified candidates while advancing mediocre ones with better formatting skills or personal connections. But the professional failure paled in comparison to the personal revelation that was emerging from Jonathan's continued research. The timing of Dr. Wilson's career transition corresponded not only with Meridian Capital's rejection of his application, but with a malpractice lawsuit that had been filed against him following the death of a young patient at Metropolitan General Hospital. The lawsuit had been extensively covered in local medical journals and news reports, with headlines that associated Dr. Wilson's name with a pediatric fatality, despite the ultimate legal conclusion that no medical negligence had occurred. Case had been dismissed by a judge who found that the death was a tragic but unforeseeable complication that could not have been prevented through any different course of medical action. But the legal proceedings had lasted nearly 3 years, during which time Dr. Wilson's professional reputation had been subjected to intense scrutiny and public speculation. Even though he had been completely exonerated of any wrongdoing, the association with a malpractice case had made him essentially unemployable in the medical field, where institutions avoided any candidates with litigation history regardless of the actual circumstances. Charlotte realized with growing horror that Dr. Wilson's career transition hadn't been a choice, it had been a desperate necessity. After being unfairly targeted by a lawsuit and professionally ostracized by the medical community's risk-averse culture, he had been forced to start over in an entirely different field just to support himself financially. The most qualified pediatric emergency medicine specialist in the region had been working as a security guard, not because he lacked ambition or capability, but because systematic institutional failures had made it impossible for him to practice the profession for which he was extraordinarily qualified. The irony was made even more bitter by the recognition that Emma's accident had been exactly the kind of situation that Dr. Wilson's expertise was designed to handle. For 18 months, Meridian Capital had been paying him to monitor security cameras and check identification badges, while possessing capabilities that could have transformed their employee wellness programs and saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars in healthcare costs. Charlotte found herself reviewing security footage from the previous day, watching Dr. Wilson's response to Emma's injury with new understanding of what she was observing. His calm competence, his professional assessment techniques, his natural ability to communicate with a frightened young patient, all of it reflected the expertise of someone who had dedicated his career to pediatric emergency medicine at the dedicated his career to pediatric emergency medicine at the highest level. The medical kit he had used to treat Emma's injury was far more comprehensive than anything typically carried by security personnel. His supplies had been carefully selected based on professional medical knowledge rather than basic first aid requirements, representing a personal investment in being prepared for situations that his current job description didn't officially require him to handle. Most significantly, his interaction with Emma had demonstrated the kind of bedside manner and clinical intuition that distinguish truly exceptional medical professionals from merely competent ones. He had known exactly how to calm her fears, explain her condition in age-appropriate terms, and provide treatment that was both medically sound and emotionally reassuring. Charlotte realized that she had been witnessing not just competent first aid, but expert pediatric emergency medicine provided by someone who was literally overqualified for any other medical position in the building. The man who had so expertly cared for her daughter was probably better equipped to handle pediatric medical emergencies than most hospital emergency rooms. The documentation of this institutional failure filled Charlotte with the kind of professional outrage that had fueled her most successful corporate reform initiatives. Her company had failed not just Dr. Wilson, but potentially dozens of other highly qualified candidates who had been eliminated by systematic bias and technological incompetence. But beyond the corporate implications, Charlotte found herself confronting a more personal realization. The man who had provided Emma with expert medical care while she had been 37 floors away in a board meeting was someone whose capabilities her own Company had failed to recognize and utilize. Dr. Wilson had been right there in the building for 18 months, possessing exactly the expertise that could have benefited not just Emma, but every employee and family member who used Meridian Capital's healthcare services. His presence had been invisible to the corporate hierarchy, not because he lacked qualifications, but because the systems designed to identify talent had systematically excluded him from consideration. Charlotte Taylor had built her professional reputation on her ability to recognize potential and optimize human resources. But in this case, the most valuable human resource in her building had been hiding in plain sight, relegated to a position that utilized virtually none of his actual capabilities. The question that haunted her as she reviewed the evidence of this institutional failure was how many other Dr. Wilsons were working in positions that didn't reflect their true potential, overlooked by systems that prioritized formatting compliance over actual competence, excluded by risk-averse policies that punished people for circumstances beyond their control. Charlotte Taylor had spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the implications of what she'd discovered about Oliver Wilson before finally deciding that the situation required direct confrontation rather than continued observation from a distance. The revelation that Meridian Capital had systematically failed to recognize and utilize Dr. Wilson's extraordinary qualifications demanded acknowledgement and, if possible, some form of corrective action. She found herself in the unusual position of preparing for a conversation that had no clear precedent in her professional experience. How did a CEO approach an employee whose actual capabilities had been so dramatically underestimated by institutional systems? How did she address a failure of recognition that reflected not just on company policies, but on her own leadership oversight? The opportunity for private conversation presented itself on Friday evening, when Charlotte deliberately stayed late to ensure that the building's executive floors would be mostly empty during Oliver's security rounds. She had dismissed Jonathan Mitchell early and cleared her schedule of the evening conference calls that typically extended her workday well into the night. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Charlotte positioned herself in the 32nd floor break room, a space that she knew Oliver would be required to inspect as part of his routine security checks. The setting was deliberately informal, neutral territory that wouldn't carry the intimidating associations of her executive office or conference room. When Oliver entered the break room carrying his standard security equipment and cleaning supplies, his surprise at finding the CEO present during evening hours was immediately apparent. His professional demeanor remained intact, but Charlotte could see the subtle tension that indicated he was calculating whether this encounter represented some form of policy violation or disciplinary concern. "Mrs. Taylor," Oliver said with respectful caution, "is everything all right? I wasn't expecting anyone to be in the building at this hour." "Everything is fine," Charlotte replied, gesturing toward one of the break room's chairs in an invitation for him to sit. "Actually, I was hoping we could have a conversation. Do you have a few minutes?" Oliver's expression became more guarded, but he accepted the invitation and settled into the chair across from Charlotte with the careful posture of someone who understood that unexpected conversations with senior executives rarely involved routine topics. "I want to talk about what happened with Emma," Charlotte began, then paused to choose her words carefully. "Not just the immediate medical care you provided, which was exceptional, but some things I've learned since then that I think you and I should discuss openly." The mention of "things I've learned" caused a noticeable shift in Oliver's demeanor. The professional courtesy remained, but Charlotte could see the wariness of someone who had experienced how investigations into his background typically proceeded. "I had my assistant run a comprehensive background check," Charlotte continued, her tone direct but not accusatory. "I think you can probably guess what we discovered." Oliver was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his response options. When he finally spoke, his voice carried resignation rather than defensiveness. "Dr. Oliver Wilson," he said simply, former director of pediatric emergency services at Metropolitan General Hospital. Is that what you wanted to discuss? Charlotte felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness at his acknowledgement. Relief that they could finally address the truth directly. Sadness at the weariness in his voice that suggested he'd had similar conversations before, and they hadn't ended well. That's part of it, she confirmed. But what really concerns me is what else we discovered. 2 years ago you applied for a position with Meridian Capital, Chief Medical Officer for our Employee Health and Wellness Division. A position you were extraordinarily qualified for, and that we desperately needed to fill. Oliver's expression shifted from wariness to something approaching bitter recognition. Let me guess, he said. Your applicant tracking system rejected my application due to formatting issues. Older credential verification codes that didn't match your software requirements. The accuracy of his assumption revealed that Oliver had encountered similar technological discrimination from other employers, which made Charlotte's next revelation even more devastating to contemplate. Exactly, she confirmed. And the position was ultimately filled through personal connections rather than qualifications. We hired someone with a fraction of your experience because her brother-in-law was on our board of directors. Oliver nodded, with the unsurprised acknowledgement of someone who had learned to expect such outcomes. And how did that work out for you? He asked with a slight edge that suggested he already knew the answer. She left 4 months ago, Charlotte admitted. The position has been vacant since then, and our wellness programs have been operating at reduced capacity. Meanwhile, you've been working security in our building, providing the exact expertise we've been missing, for a fraction of what the CMO position pays. The institutional failure sounded even more absurd when spoken aloud than it had when Charlotte had first discovered it through her investigation. The most qualified candidate had been rejected by software, replaced by nepotism, left the company anyway, and been working in their building the entire time providing superior services for minimal compensation. I know about the malpractice lawsuit. Charlotte continued gently. I know it was dismissed and that you were completely cleared of any wrongdoing. And I know that despite being exonerated, the medical community essentially blacklisted you because institutions are more concerned with avoiding the appearance of risk than with recognizing actual competence. Oliver's composure wavered slightly at this acknowledgement. Charlotte could see that having someone in a position of authority recognize the injustice of his professional treatment was an experience he'd rarely encountered. That's a fairly accurate summary, Oliver said quietly. Marcus Rodriguez, 7 years old. Routine leg fracture that developed into a fatal pulmonary embolism 18 hours after surgery. Rare complication, completely unforeseeable, could not have been prevented through any different treatment approach. But his parents needed someone to blame for their loss, and I was the lead physician on his initial treatment. Charlotte could hear the pain in Oliver's voice as he recounted the case, even though the facts clearly supported his innocence. The loss of a young patient was obviously something that haunted him, regardless of the legal conclusions about his professional conduct. 3 years of litigation, Oliver continued. Legal fees that bankrupted me, even though my malpractice insurance covered the defense costs. Media coverage that associated my name with a pediatric death, regardless of the actual circumstances. Colleagues who stopped returning phone calls because they were afraid of being associated with someone who'd been sued. And a medical community that abandoned you despite knowing you'd done nothing wrong. Charlotte added, her voice carrying genuine anger at the institutional cowardice that had destroyed Oliver's career. Risk management, Oliver said with bitter irony. Much easier to exclude someone who's been touched by litigation than to evaluate the actual circumstances. Hospitals, clinics, medical groups, they all made the same calculation. Why take a chance on someone with a complicated history when there are other candidates available? Charlotte found herself confronting the recognition that Oliver's career Destruction represented a form of systematic injustice that extended far beyond her own company's failures. The medical profession's response to his situation had been institutional, self-protection rather than support for a colleague who had been unfairly targeted. "So you started over," Charlotte observed. "New career, new identity, new set of professional expectations." "I needed work," Oliver replied simply. The security company was willing to hire someone with emergency response background, and the pay was sufficient to cover basic living expenses. I told myself it was temporary, that eventually I'd find a way back into medicine, but... His voice trailed off, leaving unspoken the recognition that 18 months of work in building security had made any return to medicine increasingly unlikely. The longer he remained outside the medical profession, the more difficult it would become to convince employers that his skills remained current and relevant. "But you've kept your medical skills active," Charlotte noted. "Your EMT certification is current, your emergency kit is professional grade, and your response to Emma's injury was exactly what you'd expect from someone practicing pediatric emergency medicine." Oliver managed a slight smile at this acknowledgement of his continued competence. "Old habits," he said. "I couldn't turn off 20 years of medical training just because my professional circumstances changed." When I heard Emma crying, every instinct I developed over my career kicked in automatically. Which brings me to the reason I wanted to have this conversation, Charlotte said, leaning forward slightly to emphasize the importance of what she was about to propose. "Meridian Capital owes you an apology for our institutional failures. Our software rejected the most qualified candidate we'd ever received. Our hiring process prioritized connections over competence, and our risk-averse policies excluded someone whose expertise could have benefited thousands of employees and their families." Oliver listened with cautious attention, clearly uncertain about where Charlotte's acknowledgement of these failures might be leading. "But more than apologies," Charlotte continued, "I want to discuss possibilities. The chief medical officer position is still vacant. Our wellness programs need leadership from someone with your level of expertise. And frankly, after watching you with Emma, I can't think of anyone I'd rather have responsible for the medical care of our employees' families." The offer hung in the air between them, representing not just a job opportunity, but potential redemption. For Oliver's derailed career and validation of his professional worth after years of institutional rejection, Oliver was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing the implications of what Charlotte was proposing. When he finally responded, his voice carried a mixture of hope and wariness that reflected his complicated history with professional opportunities. "That's an extraordinary offer," he said carefully. "But I have to ask, are you certain that Meridian Capital is prepared to deal with the potential complications of hiring someone with my history? The malpractice lawsuit may have been dismissed, but it's still part of my public record. Your insurance company, your board of directors, your legal department, they're all going to have concerns about the liability implications." Charlotte had anticipated this question and had already begun the process of addressing the institutional obstacles that could prevent Oliver's rehabilitation. "I've already spoken with our legal counsel and insurance providers," she said. "The legal dismissal of your case, combined with your exemplary professional record, both before and after the lawsuit, presents no significant liability concerns. And as for the board of directors, they're primarily concerned with hiring the most qualified candidates available. Your credentials speak for themselves." "And the Employee Health and Wellness Division?" Oliver asked. "How would my appointment be received by current staff? By employees who might research my background and discover the lawsuit?" "With honesty and transparency," Charlotte replied firmly. "Your professional qualifications are extraordinary, your commitment to medical excellence is obvious, and your personal experience with institutional injustice makes you uniquely qualified to ensure that our wellness programs operate with both competence and compassion." The conversation continued for Another hour, covering practical details about salary, responsibilities, reporting structure, and implementation timeline. But the most significant element of their discussion was the mutual recognition that Oliver's rehabilitation represented more than just filling a vacant position. It was an opportunity to demonstrate that institutional failures could be corrected, and that true professional worth could ultimately triumph over systematic bias. As they concluded their conversation and prepared to leave the building together, Charlotte found herself reflecting on how discovering Oliver's real identity had transformed her understanding not just of talent recognition, but of the human cost of institutional failures. The most qualified person for their most important medical position had been working as a security guard in their building for 18 months, providing expert services that no one had recognized or valued. But now, finally, Dr. Oliver Wilson was being offered the opportunity to practice his profession at the level his expertise deserved. And Meridian Capital was gaining the medical leadership that their wellness programs had been missing since their inception. The transformation of Dr. Oliver Wilson from security guard back to medical director didn't happen overnight, but unfolded gradually over the 6 months following his conversation with Charlotte Taylor. Like watching a professional identity slowly emerge from beneath layers of institutional rejection and personal doubt, his first day as Chief Medical Officer of Meridian Capital's Employee Health and Wellness Division began not in a sterile medical facility, but in the same break room where Charlotte had offered him a second chance at the career he'd thought was permanently lost. The symbolism wasn't accidental. Charlotte had deliberately chosen to begin their formal working relationship in the space where honest conversation had replaced corporate pretense. "I want you to know," Charlotte said as she handed Oliver his new security badge and access credentials, "that you have complete autonomy to rebuild this division according to your professional judgment. No interference from corporate policy. No requirements to justify medical decisions to non-medical personnel, and no pressure to prioritize cost savings over patient care." Oliver accepted the badge with hands that trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from the overwhelming reality that he was being entrusted with exactly the kind of professional responsibility he'd feared would never be available to him again. The badge identified him as Dr. Oliver Wilson, Chief Medical Officer, a title that restored not just his professional identity, but his fundamental sense of purpose. The first challenge had been assembling a medical team that could implement the comprehensive wellness programs Oliver had envisioned during his 18 months of forced sabbatical from medicine. Rather than hiring based on credentials alone, Oliver prioritized compassion, clinical competence, and commitment to treating each patient as a whole person, rather than a collection of symptoms. Dr. Sarah Chun, a family medicine specialist who had been working part-time at a community health center, became Oliver's deputy director. Her background included extensive experience with pediatric care and a reputation for exceptional bedside manner that reminded Oliver of his own approach to patient interaction. Margaret Foster, a registered nurse with 20 years of emergency department experience, accepted the position of clinical coordinator. Her ability to remain calm under pressure and her intuitive understanding of patient anxiety made her invaluable for the urgent care services that would be central to the Wellness Division's mission. James Rodriguez, a licensed clinical social worker specializing in workplace stress and family counseling, rounded out the core team. His expertise in addressing the mental health challenges that often accompanied physical medical issues aligned perfectly with Oliver's holistic approach to employee wellness. The medical facility itself was designed according to principles that Oliver had developed during his years in pediatric emergency medicine, where creating a calming environment was as important as providing clinical expertise. Instead of the institutional sterility typical of corporate medical facilities, Oliver's Wellness Center featured warm lighting, comfortable seating areas, and artwork selected specifically to reduce anxiety and promote healing. The examination Rooms were equipped with state-of-the-art medical equipment, but also included amenities that acknowledged the human dimension of medical care. Tablets loaded with educational resources, comfort items for patients experiencing stress, and communication systems that allowed family members to remain connected during medical consultations. Oliver's approach to employee wellness extended far beyond treating injuries and illnesses to include preventive care, health education, and support for the complex relationship between physical well-being and workplace stress. His programs included regular health screenings, nutrition counseling, stress management workshops, and family support services that recognized employees as whole people rather than just workplace resources. The response from Meridian Capital's employees was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Within the first month of operation, the wellness center was handling 3 times more patient visits than the previous medical facility had managed. Not because more people were getting sick, but because employees finally felt comfortable seeking care for concerns they had previously ignored or managed on their own. Emma Taylor became one of Oliver's most enthusiastic patients. Not because she required ongoing medical care for her scraped knee, but because her mother had recognized the value of establishing a relationship with a medical provider who understood both clinical excellence and emotional support. During Emma's routine checkup appointments, Oliver continued the kind of age-appropriate health education that had begun with their first encounter in the lobby. He taught her about nutrition, exercise, injury prevention, and the importance of communicating openly about physical and emotional concerns. But more significantly, Oliver's presence in Emma's life provided Charlotte with a model for how professional expertise could be combined with genuine personal attention. Watching Oliver interact with Emma, listening carefully to her questions, explaining medical concepts in ways she could understand, treating her concerns with the same seriousness he brought to adult patients, showed Charlotte what authentic engagement with her daughter could look like. Charlotte found herself applying Oliver's patient communication techniques to her own interactions with Emma. Instead of rushing through bedtime conversations while mentally rehearsing tomorrow's business presentations, Charlotte began asking the kind of open-ended questions that Oliver used to assess patient concerns. "How are you feeling today?" became a genuine inquiry about Emma's emotional and physical state, rather than a perfunctory greeting. "What's concerning you?" replaced "Is everything fine?" As Charlotte learned to create space for authentic communication rather than seeking quick reassurance that allowed her to return attention to professional obligations, the changes in Emma's behavior were gradual but unmistakable. The anxiety that had characterized her daily routine began to diminish as she discovered that adults could be genuinely interested in her experiences without immediately trying to fix, optimize, or educate her about everything she shared. Her sleep improved as bedtime became a time for connection rather than another scheduled activity to complete efficiently. Her appetite returned as meals became opportunities for conversation rather than nutritional optimization sessions. Most significantly, her natural curiosity and enthusiasm, qualities that had been suppressed beneath layers of performance pressure, began to resurface. The violin lessons with Maestro Fontana continued, but Emma's approach to practice shifted from anxiety-driven perfectionism to genuine enjoyment of musical expression. When she made mistakes during lessons, she began viewing them as learning opportunities rather than failures that disappointed the adults who had invested in her education. French conversation with Madame Dubois became a cultural exploration rather than a test of pronunciation accuracy. Emma started asking questions about French customs, foods, and stories rather than simply demonstrating her vocabulary retention. Even her academic performance at Whitmore Academy improved, not because she was working harder, but because she was approaching learning from curiosity rather than fear of inadequacy. Her teachers noted that Emma had become more willing to participate in classroom discussions, ask questions when she didn't understand concepts, and collaborate with classmates on group projects. Charlotte's own transformation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of the entire process. Restructuring her approach to parenthood required acknowledging that her professional expertise in optimizing business operations didn't automatically translate to understanding Emma's emotional needs. She began scheduling what she called presence time with Emma, periods specifically designated for undivided attention without phones, laptops, or any other distractions. These weren't structured activities designed to accomplish specific developmental goals, but simply opportunities to be together without agenda or outcome requirements. During these sessions, Charlotte discovered aspects of Emma's personality that had been hidden beneath the carefully structured routine of educational optimization. Emma was naturally funny, with a sense of humor that combined sophisticated observations with 6-year-old silliness. She was deeply empathetic, often noticing when adults seemed stressed or worried, and offering comfort in ways that surprised Charlotte with their emotional intelligence. Most remarkably, Emma possessed a natural leadership ability that emerged when she felt safe to express her own ideas rather than focusing on meeting external expectations. During unstructured playtime, she would organize elaborate games with complex rules and storylines that demonstrated creativity and strategic thinking that no amount of formal education could have developed. The relationship between Charlotte and Oliver evolved from employer-employee to something approaching collaborative partnership in supporting Emma's development. Oliver's medical expertise complemented Charlotte's resources and determination to provide Emma with every possible advantage, but their shared focus was now on Emma's authentic well-being rather than external achievement. When Emma experienced minor illnesses or injuries, Oliver provided medical care that addressed not just physical symptoms, but the emotional impact of being unwell. When Charlotte faced difficult parenting decisions, Oliver offered perspective based on his extensive experience with family dynamics and child development. Their professional relationship also flourished as Oliver's wellness programs began demonstrating measurable improvements in employee satisfaction, productivity, and healthcare cost management. Absenteeism decreased significantly as employees felt more comfortable seeking preventive care and early intervention for health concerns. Workplace stress-related incidents declined as Oliver's mental health programs provided employees with resources for managing job pressures and personal challenges. Most importantly, employee retention improved as people recognized that Meridian Capital valued their well-being as human beings rather than simply their professional output. The success of Oliver's wellness programs attracted attention from other corporations interested in implementing similar approaches to employee health care. Oliver began consulting with other companies, sharing the protocols and methodologies he developed while rebuilding his professional reputation within the corporate wellness community. But perhaps the most significant transformation was Oliver's own restoration of confidence in his ability to practice medicine at the highest level. The 18 months he'd spent as a security guard had been professionally devastating, but they had also provided him with insights into institutional dynamics and employee perspectives that enhanced his effectiveness as a medical director. His experience with systematic discrimination and professional rejection had given him profound empathy for employees who felt overlooked or undervalued by corporate systems. His understanding of how talented people could be relegated to positions that didn't reflect their capabilities made him particularly effective at creating inclusive healthcare programs that recognize the dignity and worth of every individual. 6 months after accepting Charlotte's offer, Dr. Oliver Wilson was no longer the broken professional who had been pushed out of medicine by institutional cowardice and legal complications. He was a medical leader whose expertise was enhanced by personal experience with adversity, whose clinical skills were complemented by hard-won wisdom about human resilience and institutional failure. The transformation was complete, but it was also ongoing, a continuous process of growth, healing, and recognition that authentic success was measured not by external validation, but by the positive impact on the lives of people who needed expertise, compassion, and genuine care. 1 year after Emma Taylor's scraped knee changed everything, Pinnacle Financial Tower had become something unprecedented in the corporate world. A building where human potential was actively recognized and cultivated, rather than systematically overlooked. Dr. Oliver Wilson's employee wellness programs had evolved into a model that other corporations across the country were studying and attempting to replicate. But the real transformation extended far beyond medical services and healthcare metrics to encompass a fundamental shift in how Meridian Capital identified and developed the capabilities of everyone who worked within their organization. Charlotte Taylor had implemented what she called potential recognition protocols, systematic approaches to discovering hidden expertise among existing employees rather than assuming that job titles accurately reflected individual capabilities. The security department underwent comprehensive skills assessments that revealed 2 former teachers, a retired paramedic, a certified accountant, and a mechanical engineer who had been working entry-level positions while possessing qualifications that could benefit the company in entirely different capacities. The cleaning staff included Maria Santos, a former laboratory technician whose expertise in chemical safety and contamination prevention made her invaluable for developing environmental health protocols. David Kim, who had been working in building maintenance, possessed an advanced degree in structural engineering and was immediately transferred to the facilities management team where his knowledge could prevent costly infrastructure problems. These discoveries led to the creation of Meridian Capital's Second Chance Initiative, a program designed to identify employees whose current positions didn't reflect their actual qualifications and provide pathways for them to transition into roles that utilized their full capabilities. The program specifically sought out individuals who had experienced career disruptions due to economic downturns, legal complications, family emergencies, or other circumstances that had forced them to accept positions below their skill level. Within 18 months, the Second Chance Initiative had transformed the careers of 47 employees while saving Meridian Capital over $2 million in recruitment costs and training expenses. More significantly, employee satisfaction scores reached the highest levels in the company's history, as people felt valued for their true capabilities rather than just their current job functions. Emma Taylor, now 7 years old, had become the unofficial ambassador of the wellness center, often accompanying her mother on weekend visits to the office, where she would help Dr. Wilson organize medical supplies and assist with health education materials. Her natural empathy and communication skills made her particularly effective at explaining medical concepts to other young visitors in ways that reduced their anxiety about doctor visits. Emma's most important role was serving as a living reminder that healing often begins with simple human recognition. The scared, anxious 6-year-old who had fallen in the lobby had transformed into a confident, curious youngster who understood that adults could be trusted to provide genuine care without conditions, expectations for reciprocal performance. The story of Oliver Wilson's journey from security guard to chief medical officer had spread throughout the corporate community, not as a feel-good anecdote, but as a powerful indictment of institutional systems that systematically excluded qualified individuals based on software algorithms, risk-averse policies, and arbitrary formatting requirements. Business schools began teaching case studies based on Meridian Capital's transformation, focusing on the economic and ethical implications of talent recognition failures. The Wilson Protocol became industry terminology for comprehensive background assessments that prioritized actual qualifications over surface-level indicators. Insurance companies revised their policies regarding professionals with litigation histories, recognizing that blanket exclusions based on legal complications, regardless of their resolution, were eliminating many of the most experienced and qualified candidates from Consideration: medical institutions across the country began implementing programs designed to support physicians who had experienced malpractice litigation, acknowledging that the current system of professional ostracism was destroying careers unjustly while depriving communities of valuable medical expertise. Most importantly, the story had resonated with millions of people who recognized themselves in Oliver's experience of being underestimated, overlooked, or relegated to positions that didn't reflect their true capabilities. Social media platforms were filled with stories of individuals who had been inspired to advocate for themselves, seek recognition for their hidden qualifications, or simply approach their daily interactions with greater awareness of the potential that might exist in unexpected places. Charlotte Taylor often reflected on how a simple scraped knee had revealed the most valuable lesson of her professional career, that expertise and wisdom exist everywhere, but recognizing them requires looking beyond titles, uniforms, and surface-level assumptions about people's capabilities. The next time you encounter someone providing service, whether they're cleaning your office, checking your identification, serving your food, or performing any of the countless support functions that keep our world operating, remember Emma Taylor and Oliver Wilson. Remember that the person in front of you might possess extraordinary qualifications that circumstances have forced them to set aside. They might be former teachers, displaced professionals, experienced specialists, or experts in fields completely unrelated to their current work. Remember that institutional systems designed to identify talent often fail spectacularly, excluding the most qualified candidates while advancing those with better connections or more sophisticated understanding of bureaucratic requirements. Remember that a single moment of recognition, acknowledging someone's true capabilities, asking about their background, or simply treating them with the respect that all human expertise deserves, can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. Most importantly, remember that healing, recognition, and transformation often begin with the simplest acts of human kindness. Sometimes the most important medicine isn't found in hospitals or prescribed by specialists. It's delivered by someone who sees past your fear to recognize your inherent worth, because everyone deserves to be valued for who they truly are, not just who they appear to be. And sometimes, the person who can change your life is wearing a uniform you never expected to notice, carrying capabilities you never thought to recognize, and waiting for someone to see their real value. That recognition starts with you. That transformation begins today. And that healing happens one scraped knee, one moment of genuine attention, and one act of authentic human connection at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.